Before dawn, the trees whispered under a veil of mist. Snowflakes swirled through the bitter cold, settling on the barrels of M1 rifles and frozen helmets. The forest was alive with sound, distant artillery rumbling like thunder beyond the hills, the creak of tank treads groaning through frost, and the low murmur of men whispering in foxholes. Somewhere ahead, a German column moved, columns of grey-clad infantry and steel beasts rolling westward, confident, relentless, unaware that the sky above held death waiting to be triggered. U.S. Army After-Action Report, Deck 1944. For weeks, Hitler's last gamble had been unfolding in these woods, the Battle of the Bulge. It was the largest battle ever fought by American forces, over 600,000 Talons. Allied soldiers faced nearly 400,000 Germans. A final strike meant to split the Western Front and drive to Antwerp. Shave Summary, Jan 1945. The Wehrmacht advanced with King Tigers, Panzer Grenadiers, and the arrogance of Blitzkrieg reborn. But on this frozen morning, something strange began to happen. Columns that had moved with ruthless precision suddenly stalled, their formations evaporating under invisible bursts of fire. Explosions erupted not just where shells landed, but around their targets, detonating in mid-air, shredding troops and vehicles alike. German officers stared skyward in disbelief as shells seemed to sense their men. Bundesarchiv, Lieutenant Fischer Diary. For months, the U.S. Army's artillery crews had been guarding a secret so closely held that even frontline gunners didn't fully understand it. They only knew their shells worked differently, deadlier, more precise, devastating. What the Germans were witnessing was the debut of a weapon so advanced it bordered on science fiction, the proximity fuse, a device small enough to fit in a shell, but smart enough to know when to explode. Office of Scientific Research and Development Briefing, 1944. The story of how this miracle arrived on the battlefield begins years earlier, not in the mud of Europe, but in the laboratories of American scientists. In 1940, a team led by Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory began experimenting with miniature radio transmitters that could detect a nearby object by reflecting radio waves, an idea drawn from the same principles that powered radar. NDRC Technical Note 1942. The concept was daring. Use a radio pulse inside an artillery shell to sense when it was close to a target, then detonate at the optimal distance for maximum effect. Engineers faced nearly impossible challenges: how to fit vacuum tubes inside a spinning shell, how to survive the shock of firing, and how to mass-produce such delicate instruments in wartime. The solution demanded collaboration between physicists, ordnance experts, and manufacturers like Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and RCA, who crafted miniature tubes with unprecedented precision. RCA Engineering Log 1943. By late 1944, the proximity fuse had already proved its worth in the Pacific. Navy gunners using the new VT, variable time fuses, had decimated Japanese aircraft at Leyte Gulf, their shells bursting in lethal clusters around kamikazes long before impact. U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance Report, Nov. 1944. But on land, the stakes were higher and the risk greater. If one fuse fell into German hands, it could reveal its secrets. For this reason, the device was classified above top secret, and its use restricted to the most controlled operations. War Department Security Directive 1944, that changed with the German offensive through the Ardennes. The Allies were desperate. The front had fractured under the sudden assault. Weather grounded Allied air power, and fog cloaked the enemy's movements. It was the perfect battlefield for surprise, and for the first time, the War Department authorized proximity fuses for ground use. First U.S. Army Order No. 31, Deck 1944. As dawn broke over the Bulge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions braced for renewed attack near Elsenborn Ridge. German artillery pounded the hills, and panzers probed through the valleys. Then American batteries answered. From snow-caked pits, 155mm howitzers of the 406th Field Artillery Group thundered to life, their shells carrying the new fuses. High above they exploded, not on impact but mid-air, raining steel fragments across advancing German infantry. The effect was catastrophic. U.S. Army After-Action Report, Elsenborn Ridge. Veterans recalled later that it felt as though the air itself had turned hostile. Soldiers caught in the open were cut down in seconds. Units dissolved under clouds of metal shards. One German survivor would later describe it as being hunted by the wind. Bundesarchiv interrogation transcript, 1945. On the American side, disbelief quickly turned to grim satisfaction. For years, they had watched German gunners dominate through precision and coordination. Now they possessed a weapon that could alter the balance overnight. Fire control officers calibrated ranges with newfound confidence, no longer aiming for the ground, but the air above enemy ranks. The mathematical perfection of the shell's timing replaced guesswork with certainty. Army Ordnance Test Data, DEC 1944. Yet the men who designed this miracle never saw the front. In windowless labs across Maryland and New Jersey, engineers worked through nights of soldering testing and recalibration. They were soldiers of science, their weapons made of glass and copper instead of steel and lead. Each tiny component was hand-assembled, each circuit tested under simulated gunfire shock, up to 20,000 Gs of acceleration. Failure was measured in microns, success in milliseconds. Applied Physics Laboratory Technical Memo, 1943. When the proximity fuse reached Europe, it arrived in crates marked only with serial codes, guarded by military police. The shells were distributed quietly to trusted artillery battalions, who were briefed under oath not to reveal the technology. Even to them it felt like magic, an invisible hand guiding destruction. But behind the science was strategy. The fuse transformed artillery from an area weapon into a precision instrument, doubling lethality against exposed troops and nullifying cover in open terrain. Army Ballistics Evaluation Report, Jan 1945. The Germans, masters of countermeasure, could only speculate. Their intelligence analysts scoured recovered fragments, convinced that hidden magnetic or acoustic sensors must be inside. They never guessed radio waves. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Technical Summary, 1945. The secrecy held until the war's end. Through December and into January, the tide of the Ardennes turned. At Bastogne, at St. Vith, at the frozen crossroads of Houffalize, the relentless precision of American artillery broke the momentum of the last great German offensive. Every shell burst above the treetops carried not just shrapnel, but the culmination of years of innovation, proof that science and industry could outthink brute force. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. By Christmas Eve, German radio chatter revealed growing despair. Reports spoke of unseen artillery that finds us, airbursts without aircraft, the sky that kills. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers hesitated to advance even under cover, fearing that any movement might trigger another invisible storm. The Ardennes became not a battlefield, but a killing ground defined by physics and invention. The snow kept falling, burying the dead and muffling the echoes of war. But beneath that white silence, the Allies had seized something priceless. Technological superiority born of intellect, not numbers. And yet, this was only the beginning, because what the world would soon learn in the bitter final months of the war was that proximity fuses were more than a battlefield trick. They were a blueprint for the age of smart weapons. Ordnance Department Post-War Review, 1946. And as the smoke lifted from the Ardennes and the German push collapsed, one question remained, whispered among those who had seen the fuse in action. What exactly made these shells so intelligent, so deadly, that even the Luftwaffe's finest and the Wehrmacht's veterans could not stand against them? That answer lay in circuits the size of a thumb, and in the minds of the engineers who built the first truly thinking weapon. The secret lay inside a shell that was no bigger than a man's forearm. Beneath its smooth steel curve, hidden behind layers of brass and explosive, was a miracle of wartime engineering, a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, designed to sense its own nearness to a target and detonate at precisely the right instant. To the untrained eye, the proximity fuse looked ordinary, but to the men who built it, and to those who faced it, it was a revolution disguised as a fuse. Technical Manual TM 9-294, 1943. The principle was simple, at least on paper. Each shell carried a tiny radio oscillator, tuned to emit a steady frequency as it flew. When that signal bounced off a nearby object, say the fuselage of a German bomber or the snow-covered helmets of an infantry column, the reflected waves caused a minute shift in the circuit's current. The moment the reflection crossed a threshold, the fuse triggered detonation. It was, in effect, a weapon that could feel distance, that knew when it was close enough to kill. Bureau of Ordnance Development Report 1944. To make it work, America's best minds had to wage a separate war, one of precision, production, and endurance. At the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Merle Tuve and Lyman Spitzer led teams who miniaturized fragile vacuum tubes until they could withstand the colossal shock of artillery launch, over 20,000 times the force of gravity. Each fuse endured tests that mimicked flight through heat, spin, and concussion, conditions under which no radio device had ever survived. Applied Physics Lab, Technical Report, 1943. At Eastman Kodak, engineers perfected the photoelectric cells that stabilized the signal. At General Electric, machinists refined copper coils smaller than a fingernail. At RCA, production lines turned out millions of subminiature vacuum tubes, each hand-tested by women technicians using magnifiers and tweezers. Every fuse was a symphony of fragile perfection, part science, part art. Assembled by hands that would never see the front lines, RCA War Production Bulletin 1944. In early field trials, the fuses stunned observers. Navy gunners in the Pacific used them to annihilate Japanese aircraft at ranges previously thought impossible. The shells burst near the plane, not on it. One astonished officer wrote, "And yet they cut it to ribbons." U.S. Navy Pacific Operations Log, 1944. The Navy's success gave the Army confidence to adapt the same design for land warfare, where it would prove even more decisive. By December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had reached its brutal peak. The German 6th Panzer Army, led by Sepp Dietrich, pushed west toward Liège and Antwerp. Their attack was supported by elite SS divisions and heavy Tiger tanks, steel monsters nearly 70 tons in weight, their 82mm guns capable of piercing any Allied armor. Oberkommando West Report, DEC 1944. The Allies, cut off and low on fuel, relied increasingly on their artillery to hold the line. It was here, near Elsenborn Ridge, that the proximity fuse met its first great test on European soil. On December 23, 1944, after days of blizzards, the skies cleared. German infantry began assembling in the open for a renewed assault. Normally, the Americans would have aimed for the ground, hoping to hit within the blast radius, but with the VT fuse, they could do the unthinkable. Set their shells to burst above the target, saturating a 50-yard zone in every direction. First U.S. Army Fire Plan, Elsenborn Ridge, 1944. The results were devastating. Witnesses described waves of gray uniforms vanishing in airbursts that seemed to hover, shimmer, then erupt. The explosions shredded trees and men alike, filling the forest with metal hail. In one engagement, a single battery of 105mm howitzers armed with proximity fuses inflicted over 60% casualties on an advancing battalion within minutes. U.S. Army After Action Report, Elsenborn Ridge, 1945. German officers were dumbfounded. Artillery spotters reported burst patterns inconsistent with impact fusing, as though the shells had learned to aim themselves. "They are not hitting the ground," one report read. "They are hunting us in the air." Bundesarchive. 12th Volksgrenadier Division Field Notes, 1945. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held out under siege. Supplies ran low and every round mattered. When proximity-fused shells arrived, they transformed defense into dominance. A single well-timed barrage could break an entire German assault before it reached the town's edge. In one documented case, a Battery B, 321st Glider Field Artillery, fired 108 shells in 4 minutes, each detonating in mid-air above an attacking column, and destroyed half a regiment. 321st GFA Fire Mission Log, Bastogne Sector, 1944. Beyond the carnage, the fuse changed the psychology of battle. German soldiers began to fear open ground. Patrols moved at night or hugged the tree line, whispering of shells that could see. Their commanders, once reliant on rapid assault formations, were forced to disperse, diluting their strength. The very doctrines of blitzkrieg, speed, concentration, momentum, collapsed under the reign of invisible precision. Oberkommando, der Wehrmacht Moral Report, Jan, 1945. But behind every success lay the quiet heroism of those who built and maintained the system. Field technicians known as ordnance men worked sleeplessly to keep the new fuses functioning in sub-zero conditions. They cleaned, calibrated, and replaced components under artillery fire, ensuring that no circuit froze, no tube cracked. Many were engineers in uniform, wielding pliers instead of rifles. U.S. Army Ordnance Service Memo, 1945. The technical superiority extended beyond tactics. It redefined logistics. Each fuse added only a few dollars to a shell's cost, but its efficiency meant that fewer rounds were needed per target. American TUE. Supply chains already stretched thin through snow-choked roads found relief in precision. In effect, science had amplified firepower without adding weight or cost. Army Logistics Division study, Feb 1945. Meanwhile, German engineers scrambled to understand what they faced. At Peenemünde, scientists dissected captured fragments under microscopes, baffled by the micro-components. Their best hypothesis was that the Allies had mastered ultra-sensitive acoustic sensors. Radio-based detonation seemed inconceivable. It required miniaturization they did not yet possess. Peenemünde Technical Evaluation, 1945. They would not learn the truth until after the war, when captured American documents revealed how far behind they had fallen. The proximity fuse's triumph came to full light during the defense of Bastogne on December 25th, when German artillery attempted to smother the encircled 101st Airborne. The counter-battery fire, using VT shells, silenced the attack within hours. Christmas Day turned from doom to deliverance, each airburst a flash of American ingenuity in the bleak Belgian sky. 101st Airborne Command Journal, Dec 1944. As 1945 dawned, the weapons legend spread. Artillerymen spoke of it with awe and superstition. Pilots flying overhead described the glowing bursts that illuminated battlefields like silent fireworks. Infantry called it the fuse that ended mass attacks. Even General George S. Patton, never one for understatement, declared, "The new shell with the funny fuse is a godsend." Patton's Third Army Diary, Jan 1945. In truth, it was not divine but human, a creation born of intellect, persistence, and collaboration. The proximity fuse represented the convergence of physics, engineering, and strategy into one lethal idea, that the closer a weapon came to thinking for itself, the less chance its enemy had to survive. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. And yet the technology's real power was only beginning to reveal itself. As the Ardennes quieted and Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the same principles that guided those fuses began to inspire a new generation of weapons, guided bombs, radar-homing torpedoes, and eventually missiles that could think, see, and choose their moment to strike. But before that future dawned, the fuse had one last role to play. In the skies above Germany, where it would turn air defense into annihilation and hasten the end of the Third Reich. Army Air Forces Technical Summary, March 1945. For now, though, amid the snow and shattered pines of the Ardennes, the secret held. German intelligence remained blind, their armies broken, their skies dark with dread. The proximity fuse had changed the rhythm of war, and soon it would change its scale. By the end of January 1945, the smoke over the Ardennes had thinned. The forests, once alive with gunfire, stood silent and broken. In the valleys lay the frozen wrecks of panzers, the twisted remnants of field guns, and the bodies of men who had marched west with the last hope of the Third Reich. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Hitler's gamble had failed. But what the German High Command could not yet grasp was that they had faced more than superior numbers. They had collided with the future. Schaff Summary Report, Feb 1945. In those bitter weeks, American artillery had fired over 2 million shells across the Ardennes front, thousands equipped with proximity fuses. Analysts later determined that these airburst rounds inflicted 5 to 7 times the casualties of conventional impact shells. U.S. Army Ordnance Statistical Review, 1946. Every explosion in the sky was the triumph of unseen minds. Scientists, engineers, machinists, each contributing a fragment to a weapon that transformed how wars would be fought. As Allied forces pushed east into Germany, the weapon's psychological power deepened. German field reports spoke of collapsing morale among frontline troops. "Our men cannot bear the constant airbursts," one report lamented. "They come from nowhere. They strike everywhere." Bundesarchiv, Volksgrenadier Corps Morale Assessment, Jan 1945. Even veterans who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk now feared the invisible. Artillery, once predictable and avoidable, had become a sentient predator, one that measured distance with the precision of a mathematician and struck with the cruelty of inevitability. By March, proximity fuses were standard issue across all major U.S. artillery divisions. The weapon's flexibility extended far beyond land warfare. When Allied air forces resumed their bombing campaigns over Germany, these same fuses found a new purpose, arming anti-aircraft shells. Over the industrial cities of the Ruhr, they created invisible minefields in the sky. Instead of guessing an aircraft's altitude and timing a detonation, radar-guided fuses exploded automatically when near the enemy's wings or fuselage. U.S. Army Air Force's Gunnery Bulletin, March 1945, Luftwaffe pilots, already outnumbered, now found the air itself hostile. "We saw nothing," one survivor recalled. "Just bursts, dozens, hundreds, each too precise to be luck." Bundesarchiv Luftwaffe Pilot Debrief 1945. The attrition was staggering. In the span of 3 months, German aircraft losses tripled, and their once formidable night raids ceased entirely. The same precision fuses defended Allied convoys from V-1 flying bombs that screamed across the Channel. Naval gunners, using radar data and VT shells, destroyed over 50% of incoming V-1s, a figure unthinkable months earlier. Royal Navy Operations Report, June 1945. The skies that had once been weapons of terror were turned into shields of control. Behind the front, engineers refined production with military discipline. The Havens plant in Ohio turned out thousands of fuses per day, while women at General Electric's Bridgeport line worked in near silence, assembling tiny components under magnifying lamps. Their precision was as vital as any soldier's aim. Each finished fuse was tested by being fired from a gun. If it survived, it was approved for battle. The failure rate dropped below 2% by early 1945, a testament to America's industrial mastery. War Production Board Report, April 1945. For the soldiers who used them, proximity fuses were more than tools, they were lifelines. Infantrymen who once dreaded counterattacks now called for artillery with confidence. "They can't mass on us anymore," wrote one officer of the 2nd Division. "We break them before they even start." U.S. Army Field Letter, Jan 1945. The shift rippled through the Allied command structure. Where once air support dictated outcomes, now artillery regained its throne as the king of battle. Generals rethought strategy around it, emphasizing precision over saturation, intelligence over brute volume. German prisoners, interrogated after the battle, often spoke of despair. "Our guns know when to explode," said one captured officer. "How can we fight that?" U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Their words revealed the deeper truth of warfare, that technology shapes psychology as much as destruction. The fear of the unseen, the perception of unstoppable intelligence, could break armies faster than bullets. Even within Allied ranks, awe lingered. The secrecy surrounding the fuse endured long after victory. Few soldiers knew how it worked. Fewer still realized its scope. The classified briefings after the war revealed that by 1945, over 22 million proximity fuses had been produced, enough to supply every Allied theater on Earth. War Department Ordnance Summary, AUG 1945. Without them, analysts later concluded, the Battle of the Bulge might have lasted another month and cost tens of thousands more lives. Yet victory carried a haunting irony. The same principles that made the proximity fuse possible, the union of electronics, radio waves, and computation, would lay the foundation for a darker age of weapons that would think for themselves. Within a decade, engineers who once built the fuse were designing the first guided missiles, their fuses replaced by guidance computers. U.S. Army Missile Development Report 1953. The technology born to end a war became the seed of perpetual readiness. Still, for those who fought in the snow, the memory remained human. Artillerymen remembered the hum of generators, the heat of the tubes, the metallic scent of cordite mixed with pine. They remembered watching shells bloom in mid-air like cruel fireworks, lighting the night sky above the Ardennes. For them it wasn't science, it was survival. After the war, Merle Tuve and his colleagues were awarded the Presidential Certificate of Merit for their invention. But Tuve himself refused to take full credit. It was not genius, he said. It was persistence and the work of many hands. Tuve interview. 1947. Those hands belonged to ordinary Americans, technicians, assembly line workers, factory inspectors, whose precision had rewritten the laws of battle. When the war's aftermath unfolded at Nuremberg and the Allied world rebuilt from ashes, few remembered the invisible device that had altered its course. It had no glory, no propaganda posters, no songs. Yet its impact was everywhere. The proximity fuse marked the beginning of networked war, the idea that intelligence and technology, not sheer force, would determine victory. Post-war defense analysis 1947. Its echoes reached far into the future. The fuse's principles guided radar systems in Korea, proximity sensors in Vietnam, and the early proximity airburst detonators of the Gulf War. In every generation of warfare since, the same concept endured. A weapon that knows, that senses, that calculates. The humble fuse had evolved into the nervous system of modern combat. In the cold arithmetic of military history, its efficiency was unmatched. Artillery kill rates in 1944-45 rose by over 400% compared to the previous year. Entire enemy formations, once the pride of German arms, were wiped out in seconds by shells that never touched the ground. The air had become a weapon, and the soldiers who unleashed it never forgot the sight of those hovering bursts, like angry suns frozen in time. Army Ordnance Effectiveness Report 1946, but beyond numbers and reports lay a moral weight. Technology had given humans the power to make the invisible lethal. For some veterans, that realization brought pride. For others, unease. We made the air itself kill, one gunner reflected years later, and we didn't stop there. Still, in the balance of history, the proximity fuse remains one of humanity's most decisive inventions, a fusion of intellect, courage, and necessity. It proved that innovation could be as potent as firepower, that circuits could turn tides, and that even in the darkest winter of war, progress marched with relentless precision. The Battle of the Bulge had begun as a German bid for redemption. It ended as proof of Allied ingenuity. In the frozen forests of Belgium, amid shattered trees and burnt snow, the world glimpsed a new form of warfare, one where knowledge became the deadliest weapon of all. U.S. Army Historical Division 1948. In later years, when asked how such technology could have emerged from the chaos of war, one of Tuve's engineers paused and said, "Because war accelerates everything, fear, hope, invention. The fuse didn't just measure distance, it measured how far we were willing to go to survive." And so, in the winter sky over the Ardennes, where men once looked up in terror and wonder, the echoes of those invisible bursts still linger, a reminder that in modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and intelligence conquers even the cold.